It's like I never see that. And anyway, so on behalf of the Robert and Artist James Foundation, who supported our next speaker, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kristin Barrus. Kristin began making quilts in 2003 using her grandmother's sheets. It's amazing you're still making quilts, Kristin. She still enjoys creating group quilts with friends, but her main focus now is making dynamic quilts that express her experiences and spirituality. After 7 years co-founding and co-directing the Utah County Modern Quilt Group, Kristin switched her focus to academia. Her areas of interest are 21st century quilt making through the lenses of women's studies, fan studies, and anthropology. And other areas within those fields are the modern quilt movement, communitas, pilgrimage, digital community, and the diffusion of innovation theory. She is currently looking at Gen X American quilt makers as entrepreneurs, fabric changes post-2000, and the rotary cutter as a symbol of the second American quilt revival. Please welcome Kristin Barrus.
Good morning. I love to study individual quilts, and I love quilt styles and time periods and eras, and my favorite, though, is quilt culture. So I appreciate you guys letting me share a little bit about quilt culture with you today. And one of the focuses I've been working on since 2019, the rotary cutter. This is the abstract of the paper. The use of ethnographic methods to examine the quilt maker's rotary cutter as an object of material culture for the first time reveals a far more complicated tool than has previously been recognized. This study performs an object biography on this overlooked tool in context by exploring innovation and the ways the rotary cutter's prevalent use has led it to become a symbol of an expansive social movement for quilt makers. The rotary cutter has interdisciplinary implications associated with entrepreneurialism, feminism, and fan studies, which I'll explain later. This paper includes a discussion outlining the rotary cutter's invention and diffusion in the quilt world, its economic impact on quilt making, and its sociological contributions to community building within the quilt world. Additionally, the rotary cutter precipitated other technological advancements and increased female-led entrepreneurialism and quilt making as a form of leisure. Ultimately, the rotary cutter has achieved iconic status within the quilt making community today. So one key factor that has been neglected as an integral player in studies of the second American quilt revival is the rotary cutter. Invented and adopted early in this critical time in quilt history, the rotary cutter enabled quilt making to become more approachable for millions of women and men. Without it, the speed and invention associated with quilt design and production today would likely have taken a different path. Many in the quilt world agree that the rotary cutter's invention in 1979 contributed to a rise in quilt making, beginning in the 1980s and continuing today, but no formal academic research has been performed to state this categorically. At present, the quilt industry continues to expand to a multi-billion-dollar market that can also be viewed culturally, given its weighty impact predominantly on the lives of women. I realize that there are other details or possible entry points for the rotary cutter's story, and I'm happy to hear about them afterwards from any of you who have experiences with that, and especially during that time period, not during the Q&A, just for the sake of time. Note that there are many more details from my data in the Uncoverings article. I'm giving you a really high level today. Although smaller numbers of men are engaging in contemporary quilt making today, this analysis refers to the female majority. Since I will be discussing the cultural impact of this technology's impact, public social media screenshots will be used throughout this presentation. Okay, so the story of the rotary cutter, I'm going to take it through the Olfa lens today with you. After World War II, Yoshio Okada was one of two brothers, and they were living in Japan and trying to repair their country, and they were working in a paper mill, and they were realizing that they were going through a lot of blades to cut all these large amounts of paper and just throwing the blades away, and there was a lot of waste, especially during a time period where the country couldn't afford waste at all of any kind. And he got thinking about an invention that would help, and one of the things that was a common material culture object of his era were the American GIs giving these chocolate bars to the Japanese that were in their MREs kits, and the way the chocolate broke off in those segments that we still have today, and also the way that glass breaks, and got thinking about that and made in that middle thin blade there in the middle, the snap-off blade. And they started the Olfa Corporation in 1956 with the snap-off blade that when it got dull, the little sections could snap off and you had a new sharp blade to go. In 1979, while watching a television show featuring a European tailor cutting a single piece of silk with long shears, which left behind frayed edges, Okada was inspired to improve this process as well. After observing both the tailor and rotating automobile tires, Okada had the idea for the rotary cutter. And the bottom one there is what Olfa Corporation considers their first rotary cutter, a picture of the actual. Initially, it was marketed as a fabric cutting tool for multiple applications. Olfa began shipping the tool with the 45-millimeter blade to Canada and the United States in 1980 through a Canadian distributor. The new tool retailed for less than $20, which is interesting. It doesn't cost a ton more than that today, and this is 45 years later. During the next 24 months, the development and expansion of this tool and its correlating supplies developed rapidly. The smaller 28-millimeter blade was introduced in 1980, and the larger 60-millimeter blade was added in 1994. Today, Olfa claims to be the world's leading manufacturer of hand-cutting tools for both craft and industrial work. And I think it's really beautiful how the makers in the room, will have one or more of this tool in your toolkit in your studios and not think about the fact that this represents international relations between two very warring countries. This was only 35 years later, after this major world war, and it was a domestic, feminized craft and art that brought these two countries back together by accepting this rotary cutter and proliferating it throughout our country and the world. The cutter is pushed away from the maker rather than toward the maker like an X-Acto knife. The maker avoids the repetition of opening and closing scissors, and scissors can be done sitting or standing. And so the rotary cutter has changed the historical ergonomics of patchwork preparation and the embodiment or the physical engagement with fabric. This new physical relationship among maker and object and the rotary cutter correlates with art historian Rosilka Parker's work on the corporal relationship women have with their needlework. So how did we get from 1979 to what the rotary cutter looks like today? This is Samara Kaha's illustrations that were featured in QuiltCon magazine for several years. And you can see the way we have this really serious object that was international relations and also changed, we'll talk here today a lot about the way it changed quilt making and sped things up to this iconography that we have today of the rotary cutter. On the left you see she has a Swiss Army knife, and she said there, it includes a diamond encrusted rotary cutter with patented forever sharp technology, great for pizza night too. And then on the right, she has this merit badge of patches you can earn as a quilt maker, and a Rotary Red Cross for sewing related first aid, which we'll talk about the gory parts there at the end. And then of course in the middle, this is an ad for Husqvarna Viking with this like mythical Viking woman with this almost life-size rotary cutter that's very emblematic. And we're seeing this all throughout. I'll give you other examples later, all throughout. So how did we get in that 35-year period, which in the history of, in the continuum of quilt making is a relatively short period of time? How did we get from these two different areas? So today I'm going to just walk you through the object biography and what that is and what that looks like, and how the rotary cutter was diffused in the quilt world, how it became a cultural marker, the other technological advancements that came after and because of the rotary cutter, some feminist contributions, this iconography, and then some cautionary tales at the end, which I'm sure you guys could all add to. The cutter led to an increased speed at which quilts could be cut out and pieced, which then led to an increase in the number of quilts a maker could create in his or her lifetime. The rotary cutter's invention contributed to an increased need for physical and financial space for quilt making in the domestic sphere, as well as the parallel escalation of female-led businesses selling new related tools and services. Today, the rotary cutter can be seen in the quilt world online and printed on fabric as holding a symbolic, even iconic fandom space, complete with a surrounding folklore of the dangers and injuries that occur during its use. So when we perform an object biography, we're looking, and this is what we do here with when we take one quilt. Where did the fabric come from? Who pieced it together? How was it pieced? Once it was pieced, what was the journey that this quilt took? So that's very much what I applied to our rotary cutter. Archaeologist Ian Hodder has said, some things are so omnipresent that we stop seeing them. They become background or frame or medium. And you can see that in this picture here from a screen grab from the Young Millennial Quilters Facebook group. You see the rotary cutter. It's very often used online to show perspective and size. And here it's in the shadow side of this picture. It's quotidian, it's forgotten. Scholar and museum professional Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett describes the quotidian as taken for granted because, quote, it presents itself as given, natural, just there, unnoticed because unassumed. Can you think of any 50% of the population that might have felt that way in the history? This is a significant material culture object of our time with an unstudied yet essential nature. The methodology I used in this study was an interdisciplinary approach revealing connections that appeal to a wider audience beyond quilt studies, including anthropology, sociology, entrepreneurialism, feminism, fan studies. It just goes on and on. It's a really dynamic tool that we use. This contemporary object's diverse narratives can be examined in many ways, including Kopytov's object biography and Sophie Woodward's object interview. Doing so begins to create a clear picture of the meanings and impact of this tool. I used an ethnographic term called interpretive constructivism, which is a fancy way to say that general knowledge is created by the group or the community. It's not top-down, it's community-driven in a collective informal awareness or agreement. I used participant observation from online, as we see in some of these pictures. I interviewed merchants and artists in fieldwork and then looked at trade publications. So how did it get dispersed through the quilt world? It's a great question. Marty Michelle gave me a lot of her time, which was great. And she says here we stacked up old newspapers and cut strips and danced when she and Mary Ellen Hopkins figured out how to use this new tool. It was like magic for people. I heard that a lot. It was the kind of thing you shared as soon as you got it. Quilt makers have always been really great at sharing knowledge, whether it's scholarly and academic based or more in context based. Not only did historic inventions such as various weaving looms, transformative dyes, the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, and the mechanized sewing machine advance fabric and sewing, these inventions also affected and altered the lives of the women and men who worked with them in their factories or their homes, and the rotary cutter is just another one of these objects. 21st century changes in technology include continued evolution of the sewing machine, the computerization of the long-arm quilting machine, the development of instantly downloadable PDF patterns, the use of social media, and the rise of digital design programs, to name just a few. So it's just another spot on this continuum. How did the rotary cutter get in the quilt world? Sociologist Rogers argues that diffusion is fundamentally a social process, as we see here with Marty's experience. This tool is another innovation in the continuum of textiles that deeply affected not only fabric culture, but domesticity, women entrepreneurs, and e-commerce. Quilt makers became a natural consumer market for this traditional tool early on as they recognized its use for their art form and began sharing it spontaneously within their communities. Perhaps some of you experienced that yourselves. Traditionally, quilt makers would either tear fabric into strips, use plumber's chalk, or mark scissor cut lines along using dots with long wooden yardsticks. Marty remembers the way the introduction of the rotary cutter a few years after beginning her business, yours truly, quote, changed everything. Michelle met Okada in January of 1980 at the National Needlework Association's convention. Okada told Michelle the cutter was designed to cut silks for apparel construction, but that he wanted to use it in quilt making as well. Initially, she was not interested in this new invention because there was no associated cutting mat when it first came out to protect your tabletop surfaces, and she feared the dining room table would end up looking like the bottom of her pizza pan. Around the same time, Barbara Sweetman of YLI also began importing the new tool from Ulfa and tried to convince Marty to use it. So here's a second person that is trying to convince Marty to get into it. But the first time Marty remembers successfully using the cutter, which this quote is from, was with Mary Ellen Hopkins in her store Crazy Ladies and Friends in LA in the late 1980. A notions salesman had likely sold Hopkins what was called a notions wall, or a display of a variety of sewing and quilt making notions that probably included this unexplored rotary cutter. After they realized what they could do with it, Hopkins made acrylic strips that were about 2 inches by 24 inches, because there were no rulers either, to replace the wooden rulers for the dot marking method. The two added silkscreen lines to the acrylic strips, and in 1981 began teaching week-long seminars for shop owners and teachers using this new system. They also demonstrated the new cutting system at the early schoolhouse demonstrations during the International Quilt Festival in Houston. And really fast, it became this cultural marker. You see here in this picture today, this is one quilt maker's rotary cutters. Not only does she have this many, she's not hiding them, and she's displaying them in this artistic way and posting it online where the private becomes public. And she says there, I think you all know what my favorite notion is. Rachel May, who's a beautiful author who wrote about modern art, also called it the quilter's best friend, which was interesting. The rotary cutter became widely accepted and dispersed. Nancy Crow expressed her instant love of the rotary cutter, aiding her in making more expressive quilts. Our own Meg Cox argued, quote, "It sparked a revolution comparable to the effect of the food processor on home cooking." That's a pretty big thing to say about an analog tool, the piece of plastic, which I will point out, the original one was for lefties or righties, so it was like the inclusive tool of a lifetime before they were even thinking about trying to be inclusive. Art quilt maker Linda Seward told me it was the most important thing that happened to quilters. This ethnography of the rotary cutter and its use reveal how technology led to this cultural shift in processes. In 2017, it's estimated that between 7 to 10 million people engaged in quilt making in the United States alone. Even if every maker owned just one rotary cutter, that would add up to millions of rotary cutters throughout just the United States alone. I have this idea of hundreds of years from now, archaeologists will be digging up all these little round blades and wondering, what is going on? What happened with these people? They were so fascinating. Yes, it's true, we were. And then other technology came along with this. Virginia Dickey is she's retired, an occupational therapy professor. And she looked at the rotary cutter as through the eyes of ergonomics of the hand use of it. And she said quilters had a seemingly endless quest for ways to simplify techniques while simultaneously producing more work of increasing complexity, behavior that supported and was supported by new tool development and marketing. And we see this throughout all of quilt making. In a similar way, the succession of technologies invented around thread and cloth manufacturing in the 18th and 19th centuries built upon each other. This new blade necessitated further inventions in the late 20th century. A new wheeled blade in the home required a cutting surface that would not be damaged with each cut. Olfa developed their signature green self-healing mat used with the new blade soon after the rotary cutter. Clear acrylic rulers with painted grids were also created by other manufacturers and quilt makers, rounding out the trio of basic notions in a quilt maker's tool set. For example, Fred and Jerry Salem of Salem Manufacturing, who imported sewing machines from Japan, had first seen the rotary cutter over there. They held the market for a number of years with the first 1/8 inch thick 6x24 acrylic ruler with lines. They called it, anyone remember or have them at home? The Salem ruler. In the United States, the new technology was embraced and rapidly created a sizable market for new consumer products. And then, the American way, competition began. Companies like Omnigrid and Fiskars began designing and selling their versions of the rotary cutter and its mates. Omnigrid was created by Peggy and Randy Schaefer in their carport in 1979, this explosive second revival era. These early companies and many others have produced an assortment of rotary handles, such as ergonomic and curved, straight, pinking and scalloped edge blades, with a variety of shapes, colors, and sizes of mats that fold, rotate, and light up. Rulers range in size from 1 inch to 2 feet in squares, rectangles, and other shapes, including 18-degree wedges for Dresden plates, all kinds of things. Quilt makers stacked fabrics and used the standard circular blade to slice quickly through long strips of fabric, and the smaller blades to cut quickly around plastic templates. This new approach affected quilt styles and patterns significantly. Many successful designers, women such as Eleanor Burns, Marnie Michelle, and Bethany Reynolds, to name just a few, made a name for themselves using the rotary cutter for quick strip cutting methods. By the turn of the 21st century, the number of quilts being made rapidly increased. As quilt makers produce quilts using faster techniques, the demand for long arm machines, which offer a motorized replacement for laborious hand quilting, increased. Some consumers purchased large and expensive long arm machines to finish their own quilts, or to establish a small business offering machine quilting services to people who prefer to create quilt tops and delegate the quilting. Due to the way quilts are loaded on the long arm machine's frame, rotary cutters are very helpful for trimming the excess batting and fabric after the quilt has been machine quilted and removed from the frame. Compared to scissors, the rotary cutter makes quicker, straighter edges on those long sides. It's an indispensable use of particularly the 60mm blade, and it's often done using the extra long rulers. So this is, I was trying to think, well, what's the next thing? What's replacing rotary cutters? And several versions of the rotary cutter have been developed, but no tool to date has completely replaced it. Today, companies like Cricut, Sizzix, and AQQuilt make fabric cutting machines that use rolling pressure through die cuts, which allow quilt makers to quickly crank out precisely cut shapes of all sorts. Recently, rechargeable and corded electric rotary cutters and more like jigsaw blades, like you see in this picture of the big stack of fabric, are becoming more widespread for makers who sell large quantities of fabric kits or own quilt stores. Brands like C, Golden Wall, Hercules, and Works easily slice through much larger stacks of fabric without needing the operator to apply any hand pressure. Again, changing the corporal relationship between the tool and its use and the maker. And you'll notice in this picture, this is art gallery showing how they're cutting their fabrics. She's wearing that silver glove on her opposing hand, and that was another technology that came about, and it was more in the kitchen that got brought over into quilt making to protect another adaptation that came because of the rotary cutter. On the other one, you see our Ty Flanagan, and Ty is the one who made the geometric modern quilt that was on the cover of Uncoverings a few years ago. And this is he and I having a discussion about how he cuts fabric, because he uses a laser cutter to cut his really precise pieces that he's showing us there. Let's see, he was sharing his method of laser cutting fabric using computer numerical control machine technology, or a CNC machine. He uses the one at the labs at the DC Public Library in Washington. And CNC technology operates in a manner similar to the way designs are input in a computer for a long arm machine and that move across quilts. Instead of a needle stitching, lasers burn through the fabric with precision. Initially, Ty experimented with custom-made template plastic, making rotary cutting more precise for the Islamic geometry-influenced shapes he often uses. He then moved to laser cutting the intricate shapes directly into the fabric with a universal laser system. Glowforge is an at-home tabletop 3D laser cutter that is currently being experimented with by a small number of quilt makers. And as I've been talking to other women who are entrepreneurs and have businesses with various uses of CNC within their home, whether they're cutting laser templates to sell or trying to cut their own fabrics, the big problem is the ventilation. You have to have a venting system. It's really critical. And one woman has kind of an outbuilding on her property that they bought it for that had a derelict kitchen, and they've hooked it up into the kitchen hood ventilation system so she can use a CNC inside in her home. And you can see Ty's little cuts that he makes here that are similar to garment construction. And he was showing me really closely because I said, does the fabric smell? Is it black on the edges? How realistic is this for us to do? And there's more about it in the paper, but he does talk about how it's a big waste of fabric. He really likes it for precision, but it's hard to use every piece of the fabric, and you end up with a lot of odd-shaped scraps that aren't as useful as others. Feminist contributions. Mary Beth Staup said, some quilters use pegboard panels to line the walls of their rooms, hanging quilt tools such as rotary cutters on hooks, familiar to a man's workshop. And I think we really do have Julia Child to thank for this, for bringing pegboard into our lives and making it normalizing tools, being all tools and not just motorized tools in a garage. And this happens very much in the quilt maker's world too. And you can see here Tula Pink's handmade collection, I'll show you a little bit about later. She's using what you could consider a tool that is more mechanized and machinery, and she's making it very floral and feminine, including the foot pedal. Whoever thought you could make a foot pedal sexy on fabric, and she totally did it. Of course, Tula Pink is gonna do it. So it's a really significant thing to say that women are so predominant in the economic aspect of quilt making, but it's not just what we're buying, it's the businesses that are being made, which is my current passion to study. So the proliferation of the rotary cutter led to many new women-owned and quilt-related businesses, creating a larger economic space for women to engage in entrepreneurialism. Small businesses were born from the quilter's ability to use the rotary cutter to produce more quilts faster, leading women to open independent quilt stores to meet increased demand. These women could design and sell kits because the rotary cutter made the kits easy and quick to assemble. Shop owners and other creatives could invent new rulers and templates to capitalize on this trend. Many of these businesses could be run from home alongside domestic tasks or in addition to full-time employment in the public workforce. Quilt making, a traditionally female-dominated art, began to require much more money and physical space in the home. So there's some negotiation there, which Mary Beth has studied a lot. Let's see. The increase in participants in the quilt world in the 80s and 90s also led to the new long-arm machine businesses in the home, and in the 2000s and teens, changes to fabric design and manufacturing, expanded magazine publishing, increased participation in professions such as convention and retreat organizers, collectors, quilt museum curators, that there were quilt museums, the quilt store owner were and are, the quilt store owners, and then once quilt makers engaged with the internet and social media in the 2000s up to today, other professions popped up like online retailers and pattern makers, bloggers, quilt photographers, and digital instructors, developing a considerable niche market. Many, if not most, of these companies are created by, led by, or employ women. And I will tell you a little sneak preview of my doctoral work that I'm doing right now. When I asked these 24 women in my survey to anonymously tell you what they earn in a year, a majority of them are earning over $100,000 a year. This is not a side small business for these women. Some of them it is, but it is lucrative and successful and possible. So let's look at this tool as an icon, have a little bit of fun here. This piece I love, and I'm sorry I don't have the measurements for it, but you can get it. It's Quilt Free by Karen Roberts from the Quilt Loft in Oregon, evilmadquilter.com. This is laser cut. The whole thing comes with the iron-on on it in the pieces. It's really fun to do and put together, kind of going back to the old quilt kits 100 years ago, right? I love that it's just all part of this continuum. And look at this iconography of the woman of our country and holding up the rotary cutter, quilt free or die. That's amazing. I have this on my little ID bracelet on my road bike in case I ever got in an accident and was unconscious, where their phone number is. And so whenever I take it into the the bike shop every year to have it maintained for me, they always laugh, like the quilter's here, because they see that it says quilt or die on my tag on my bike. Barbara Lane and Sue Rowley did a really beautiful photography project on women's hand tools, and they said, leisure and labor, home and factory, the history is etched with the fatigue of gestures and an infinity of desire. And desire is the part I want to talk about here briefly. Fan studies is the study of the emotional connection we make to the imagination. It could be a book or a movie. It could be a quilt. It could be a quilt object like the rotary cutter. It's celebrity, and we have it a ton in the quilt world. I hear the term celebrity a lot in my work. But it's that desire and it's that connection, and social media and the internet have really broken down the barriers of privacy in the way that a lot of people share their private life publicly and are happy to do that, and then other people engage, and you meet with somebody in real life and you're like, oh, I know that she just had a miscarriage last year, or I know her son is autistic, or whatever, because she shared it online, or she or he have shared it online, and then we get up to them in person and it's this awkward, like, oh, I know way more about this person than I should, but I don't know what to say to them in real life. And it happens a lot, and there's a lot of fun that goes along with all of that, and I think that's really important to celebrate and study and look at and enjoy in the quilt world today. So let's look at a few other examples of iconography of the rotary cutter in the quilt world today. These are my two friends, they're sisters. The rotary cutter is always in a selfie booth. Any quilt event that has a selfie booth is going to have some size of a cardboard rotary cutter for somebody to hold up and smile with. On the far right is Maker Valley. If you don't know about her t-shirt company, it's amazing. They do fresh designs all the time. It's a husband and wife team that really, really exploded in the Utah area. And there again is the rotary cutter, and Joanna sent me an awesome picture of a friend of hers at a retreat that had a rotary cutter on her t-shirt. It's just really, really prevalent, but it's so quotidian that we forget about it and we don't realize. But this is really a symbolic iconography of the quilt world today that means something more than just a decorative, something to put, as a, art gallery did it as a sticker you could use on your social media. And then again, here's another example of Tula Pink's homemade fabric line. And then this piece by Eye Candy Quilts, I really encourage you to look this piece up online. They did kind of a tarot card panel of this beautiful empowerment. They have one of like 9 of irons, and it's got all these different irons. It's really great. But look, again, here's this mythical, non-sex person that could be anybody, like holding it up again like the torch and saying, I'm proud to be a quilt maker, and this is what I do, and it's kind of magical and mythical and imaginative. And we see this all the time coming up now in 21st century quilt making with this tool that's 45, 50 years old. In 2015 at QuiltCon, a quilt maker, I've been studying the themes in the shows at QuiltCon the last several years. And Emily Sear, in her artist statement one year, said, I like to play with rotary cutters, much like Edward Scissorhands likes to play with hedge trimmers. Those of you who know that movie. And it has its own fan following. And so we see direct fan links in the quilt world as well, like Emily's making here between a movie with a cult following and quilt making, besides the fact that we all have fan people that we follow in the quilt world. I shouldn't say we all. A lot of us have people in the quilt world that we follow and fan over. Obviously, I am a big fan of Tula Pink. And now for the bloody part. The cautionary tales. So Bavor, the academic answer to this is, Bavor, Perrick, and Genghis said, tool use is not only a matter of recognizing that an object is a tool, but also of knowing how to hold and manipulate that particular tool. And here is a woman who works in some sort of quilt shop, I'm assuming is an online quilt shop because of all the shipping boxes behind her and the non-beautiful way that she has all of her shelves and everything. This is for Halloween, and she says, Happy Halloween from the rotary cutter that cut my finger. And there's other pictures on this post of her dancing as this enormous rotary cutter. I mean, it's hysterical, and we laugh because we all relate to this. How many of you have cut yourselves on a rotary cutter, right? It's not small. There's a reason there's that silver glove. Some people, the first time I saw it, a woman was wearing it at a retreat at Anna Maria now, somebody help me, what's her new last name? Perry, Anna Maria Perry, thank you. And I was like, what's this glove? And she took it off and had this terrible scar, and I thought, yeah, I would wear that too all the time if that had happened. Like PTSD this woman had from her rotary cutter, but yet she loves quilts so much that here she is still at this retreat. Quilt maker and NASA astronaut Karen Nyberg mentioned she was not able to use a sharp-bladed rotary cutter at the gravity-free International Space Station. It was outlawed. But they did let her bring the scissors. I was kind of wondering, in that picture have you seen with her hair floating? It's so beautiful. So Tula Pink said she does Tula talks is it Tuesdays still? And she talks about her new things. And in one of her earlier Tula talks, she relates her first experience making a quilt, and this is what she says. I was 12. I was the youngest person in the class by about 45 years. And they handed me what I thought was a pizza cutter and a needle with a motor on it and told me, now we're going to make a quilt. I proceeded to cut off the tip of my finger right away, immediately. And then I sewed my dress to my quilt top. So at the end of the class, the teacher handed my mom her money back for the remaining 2 classes and very respectfully and kindly asked her not to bring me back. And she says, I get it. I don't blame her. I was an anarchist anyway at 12 years old, and they handed me all of these dangerous objects. It was like my best day ever, but their worst day ever. And so many fun stories like this that, I mean, we need to just laugh and have that camaraderie within any part of quilt studies in the quilt world. It's a big, big quilt world, and yet the rotary cutter is a touch point for all the different styles and ages and genders and types, and it's just, I love this one object. Tula Pink's childhood incident is typical of learning to use such sharp tools upon entry in quilt making at any age. The rotary cutter persisted despite fears and injury. The benefits outweighed the unintentional lacerations. Sometimes portrayed humorously, the fear and precautions of cutting oneself with the blade have become a noteworthy cultural aspect associated with this tool. Let's look at it a little bit more. This picture on the far left is a screen grab, and you don't see the wound. I made sure it's very, very covered up. This woman was moving, and for some reason her blade was loose from the handle and slipped out of the box, and of course she stepped on it. And this is a picture of her. I mean, look at the size of that wrap over her foot on the way back from the ER. I feel like she kind of wins. And she took a picture of the rotary cutter as it was, like she got home, and there it is, stuck in the carpet, face up, and it's got her blood on it and everything. I know, so excruciating. This quilt on the right is called Who Needs to Tell a Story, A Day in the Life of a Quilter, made by the Tulsa Modern Quilt Guild for a charity event at QuiltCon. I think this is one of the greatest 21st century quilts, and it was donated to a charity. And let's look through really quickly. It's like you read a book from the top down. This particular quilt maker is a very traditional married with children maker. She gets out of bed, she kisses her husband, she has several cups of coffee, she has her morning bathroom routine. She makes breakfast, she takes the dog for its morning bathroom routine, they're on the 3rd row, and then she gets to sew. And she's doing flying geese, and some of them got backwards, and frowny face, and the unpicker. And then she gets in the car to take kids to various lessons and have ice cream, and then she gets time for herself again. And oh no, she cuts herself, and there's the bloody rotary cutter. And that shocked face and a Band-Aid. And then she gets back to making more flying geese, and doing more house things. They pig out on pizza. She has chocolate and wine. And then it looks like maybe in the evening she does handwork because we have thread and scissors, more wine. She's kissing her husband, the lightning bolt, and the wing. So just a wonderful, wonderful illustration of her day in the life of a quilt maker that some of us might be able to relate to some parts of. I will point out, it's hard to see on the screen, in this very taupey black gray picture illustration she's made, the rotary cutter blood is the only color on the whole quilt. It's a really beautiful burgundy wine color, but she's showing that it was bloody on the rotary cutter. Okay, bell hooks said, objects are not without spirit. As living things, they touch us in unimagined ways. And Ellen DeSaniaki also said, where once ordinary things acquire the potency of standing for extraordinary things. In spite of all humanity's digital advancements, one of the central hand tools used by quilt makers to create in the last 45 years remains the simple rotary cutter. Rotary cutters have much more to impart than cutting quick strips and being set aside. While not around as long as the needle or scissors, rotary cutters play a role in a quilt maker's expressive, creative life, as well as correlated consumer products and entrepreneurialism, international relations, feminism, and community building. Investigating this common plastic tool reveals multi-layered implications and outcomes from its invention in 1979 through a rapid succession of women-led technological advancements and businesses to its current emblematic place as an iconic symbol of a large fan community. I would just like to thank my professor at the time at UNL, Dr. Claire Nicholas, and Joanna Evans for her beautiful editing as always, and OFA Corporation for supporting my data, and especially Marianne Fons, and I don't want to embarrass her, but this is a great example of why AQSG is amazing. I just met her briefly once at QuiltCon, and I reached out, and I don't have a collection of every Quilter's Newsletter magazine, because I wasn't fortunate enough to have come during that period. I'm fortunate enough to come during the Tula Pink and Ty Flanagan era. And Marianne went and sat in her, was it a basement or an attic, and went through dozens of copies of this magazine for me and kept emailing me scans of anything that had to do with the rotary cutter, and contributed largely to this project of mine. And I really appreciate that, and I hope that we're all continuing to reach out to each other like that. We can't all know everything, and we can't all have lived everything. But contemporary quilt making, and when I say contemporary, I mean in everybody's lifetimes here, because it's been going on for centuries before this all over the world. It's really important that we share that knowledge and what we have and the tools we have and the ephemera that we have, and I so appreciate that great example. Other trade articles that I've written about the rotary cutter can be found in Quilters, or what was it, Quilting Arts magazine from this year and QuiltCon magazine this year. And Yannick and I did a great podcast on the Running Stitch podcast for help me. Thank you. Quilt Alliance. That's it. My brain is done. For Quilt Alliance, which I don't ever forget. Wonderful. Listen to their podcast. They're really great. I'm currently sharing my research on the modern quilt movement and the rotary cutter and QuiltCon and my current work with Gen X entrepreneurial women on my Instagram, and that's my handle if you're interested in following along with any of that. So thank you. I know that a lot of you want to tell me about your experience with the rotary cutter, but if any of you, and I'm happy to hear them another time, but later today, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes, Millie.
Hold on.
Oh, we have microphones.
There you go.
Yay, thank you.
Like I need one. That's what Jody said. Sorry. I'm interested, you talked about the connection between the rotary cutter and international diplomacy.
Yes.
You know, that.
Yes.
Did you run across any other instances where women's handwork, women's craft art through fabric, textile, became instruments of diplomacy?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to say yes because of my own personal experience. And I'm also going to say no, nothing specific academic that I could technically point to in this moment.
All right.
I love the way the International Quilt Museum has framed itself as international, and the way Marin works really hard to get, for us to see that there is a lot of international things happening today, particularly her with her Asian work in connecting Asian quilt makers. The great thing about the internet today, which is more ephemera and not something that's been studied in the quilt world enough for me to point to and say this person or this study, is the way we're influencing each other. Carolina Onito, who is in Brazil, is teaching all over the world in 3 languages, online and in person. And although our countries never strictly warred, I love the fact that that's international diplomacy to me within the quilt world. And that's because of the internet and the way quilt makers are wrangling the internet. I can't believe anybody uses the internet for anything outside of quilting, because it's such a big deal for us. And so in my experience, it's totally happening. But to say one tool and one direct country, I can't
Yeah.
speak to.
Okay, so do you think the Japanese connection, was it incidental diplomacy or
Yeah.
was it intentional?
I do. No, I think it was incidental. I
Incidental.
think Okada was a great businessman, and he knew where his market was.
I just think this is interesting
Yeah.
because in Iowa in the 50s, there was an intentional farm connection, sending hogs to Japan.
Sure,
So
yes.
the things that the men did, it was intentional diplomacy. This incidental
Great
diplomacy that happens
Yes.
with women and the connections we make is why I really think quilters should be ruling the world.
Yeah, I do. I totally think so. Yeah. Thanks, Melly. That's awesome. Any other questions before I step down? Oh, yeah, over here.
Very brief comment. It's not limited to revolutionizing women's work. My husband and other people who are involved in antique car restoration extensively use rotary cutters.
Yes.
And he got his separate from mine, and I didn't even realize he had them in the workshop. But they use them extensively. It's changed how you cut leather for upholstery, some carpeting.
Yep. Yep.
Gaskets, engine gaskets, oil gaskets, etc.
That's awesome.
He's got, like I said, he's got his own set.
Thank you. I do mention that in the article. It's being used in dissection and then clothing, mass producing all the fast fashion that we're.
My
struggling with.
question's related to that. What came first, the pizza cutter?
Oh, here
The
you are.
pizza cutter or rotary cutter?
Yeah,
What
great.
came
That's a great
first?
question. I looked at that. The Italian pizza cutter has been around longer. The first instance I could find of something that said rotary cutter was in the 1890s in the Smithsonian, which was before it was the Smithsonian. They mentioned taking one to the World's Fair, which was cool. And that's noted in the article too. You can look that up. Yeah,
Good morning.
I'm
My
not
brain's
repeating
not.
questions. I'm so sorry.
It's not a question, it's a comment. It was a long time ago that I read about it, but who's remembering the Boise peace quilts that were exchanged between Boise, Idaho, and Moscow,
Oh, yes.
protesting nuclear
Uh-huh.
proliferation?
Yes, thank you for pointing that. She was talking about the connection between Boise and Russia. Was it the USSR during that connection? And we sent quilts to Ukraine last year by the buckets full. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Haley.
Going back in time, I really focused on your highlighting the ergonomic difference in
Yes.
quilt making that the
Yes.
rotary cutter makes. I mean, it's fundamentally changed what
Yes.
quilt making is, I
Yep.
think, because when the women I've studied up in northern New York sat down and in the evening, or anyway, whenever they could sit down, it was a leisure time activity because they could sit down, put their feet up, and cut little pieces. Now you have to stand up and
It's more
work hard.
physical, yeah, very much more physicality.
And it really has also put the focus on design, especially when you add the mechanized quilting. You've got a whole culture of people who want to bang out designs
Yeah,
and then move on to the next one. It
Yep.
isn't as
Yep.
holistic as it once
that's
was. I think.
awesome. Thank you. Thank you. One more, Susie. Oh, 1 and 2. We'll do Susie and then let me come over. Oh, sorry.
Do you think that we have more quilts with straight lines because of
That's a great
rotary
question.
cutter?
Yeah.
And that perhaps the idea of using curves sort
Right.
of kind of declined?
Yes,
and now
that's a great question. What do we think? Oh, yes. And Colleen did, I was going to say I didn't study that, but Colleen did study with pre-cuts. The idea of these package strips from the manufacturers or package squares probably really impacted that a lot too. Maybe even more than the rotary cutter because they're giving that design element. Yeah, great question. Yes.
Hi, my question was, since the rotary cutter was developed in Japan, did they use the rotary cutter in Japan first? And do you think that?
That's a great question. ULFA does not feel like it.
Okay.
They do not feel like it. And I feel like, and somebody can correct me, the Japanese experts in the room, there are some techniques and makers who prefer scissors because of the designs that they're making. So I don't know. That would be a great one to have Maren Hansen up here to answer for me.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know how popular it was in their own country.
Thank you.
Great question. Yeah, there's so much about this that can add to what we do. Okay, Colleen, and then we'll cut it. I'm out. Just say it and I'll repeat it. Oh, here comes Becky. Thanks for the microphones. That's great today.
Well, you are awesome, obviously. I was just going to share that I've only used the rotary cutter for quilting, and when I started teaching apparel design, all my students started using rotary cutters to cut out their garments, and I was terrified, and I was like, oh my God, you're all going to die. You're
Yeah.
all going to cut
Yeah.
yourself. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to cut on a curve with a rotary cutter. I only know how to do straight
So
lines. So it's interesting for me to see the next generation of even
Freehand,
non-quilters
lots of freehand rotary
using
cutting.
the rotary cutter to do apparel design and
Yeah.
things like that. And it's, I thought it was only in quilting spaces, and suddenly it's all in apparel
Cool.
design
I
now.
love it. But see, it's that organic sharing. It just keeps seeping. In a world that's so plugged in, and we have this one easy tool that just really doesn't change. Okay, thank you very much.